Hello everybody, time for another automotive confession. Had you asked me before today, have I driven a smart car, the answer would have been no. Now, the truth is that technically speaking, I have driven a much later Smart for 4 Brabus. But let's be honest here, you mention smart car to just about anybody and there's only one thing they're going to think of. This, the original first generation, the instant icon. A car which in very, very many ways, like the slightly later Audi A2, was far ahead of its time in its aim of trying to improve both emissions and congestion through the use of fairly cutting-edge technology. But you see, there is a key difference between those two cars, where they both have slightly quirky, oddball looks that are inevitable with their mission aim. The Audi A2 is a car that I actually really rather like. It has some really cool features, technology, some genuine innovation, and it's actually not all that bad to drive. Whereas, before today, had you asked me what I thought about the smart car, I would have told you that I hated it because, simply put, this is a total and complete bag of shit. The Smart for 2, as it later became known, launched first as the Coupe way back in 1998. 25 years ago, the product of the most unlikely of collaborations between Mercedes-Benz, the noted car maker, and Swatch, the cheap watch firm. Though exactly how much input the latter had by the time this reached production, I could not say. In any case, the car caused quite a stir on its launch. Of course, the idea of a small car is far from new. They've existed for a very long time in everything from the Peel P50 and of course the famous P45 to the Isetta bubble car in its many guises, even things like the Reliant Robin. However, there were a couple of different ways that the Smart aimed to be genuinely different, not just in terms of its dinky dimensions. One of the major differences between the Smart and many of its forebears are that those attempted to be a 4-seater, to varying degrees of success, but this simply didn't bother. Instead, it dedicated itself to being, a practical as it could be for its size, 2-seater only. And that, I think, was a very wise design decision, because from in here, it still feels like a relatively spacious vehicle. However, there were some more significant engineering things about it too. First off, where many other small cars had to sacrifice an element of safety, by the late 1990s, this was no longer acceptable. Although, believe it or not, this and the classic Mini were actually in production at just about the same time, with the former being in production until essentially the turn of the millennium. However, this wasn't introduced in right-hand drive guise until 2001, so I expect on UK forecourts they missed each other by the narrowest of margins. In any case, this car was designed with safety as a priority concern, and it's for that reason it introduced this amazing concept of the Tritium safety cell. That nice silver piece you can see on the side, that's actually a crash structure. You are contained within it, cocooned essentially in what is actually a fairly decent, well-built and durable cage. Quite a cool thing. It means that when you knock on the side of the car, that's not bodywork, that's the chassis. The blue bits are bodywork constructed of ultra lightweight plastic, and they are definitely ultra lightweight because I daren't really mount many cameras to them because it's quite so flexible. That meant that this was the lightest car on sale at the time, about 150 kilos lighter even than a Lotus Elise, and that is impressive.
Even the construction of the smart car took a considered approach. A brand new factory was established in France, dubbed Smartville, where the central construction facility was surrounded by suppliers who made the key components of the car. It was a very lean, modern and efficient facility, costing 450 million euros and was opened in 1997. Today, it is also the home of Ineos and where the new Grenadier is being assembled.
But perhaps the boldest move of Smart, much like the later Audi A2, and one which might have been its undoing, is that unlike nearly all other small cars, it didn't try to be cheap. In fact, this was positioned very, very high in the marketplace. At the time, it was considered a very expensive thing, considering what you got. And that is just one of the reasons that I remember my younger self not being all that impressed with the smart car. I do recall my friend Alex's family actually had a couple of these. They had a couple because the first one got written off while Alex was driving it. And no, he wasn't being typical silly young person. He was simply driving along one day when somebody pulled out of their driveway and he T-boned them. I have to say, in that case, the Tridian crash structure did its job perfectly, and he was fine, as was his bow and arrow kit that was in the back of the car at the time. However, on the occasions we went out in it, I recall us mocking its pretty poor ride, its ridiculously poor gear shift, and the fact that, perhaps predictably as a small car, it just didn't have any room in it. And so, from that point onwards, as far as I was concerned, the smart car was a bit of an in-joke. But that was nearly 2 decades ago. The world has changed, and so have I. In the cold light of a slightly dreary May day, how does the Smart ForTwo actually fare? Well, I'm happy to say, quite a bit better than I thought. This example has been brought to me by a lovely chap called Paul, who is a petrolhead with an eclectic taste. He got in touch a good few months back and offered me a selection of different cars that he owned, including the likes of a 2CV. But amongst this interesting machinery was a Smart ForTwo. And when I saw it, I said, Paul, I know you're going to call me crazy, but I gotta have a go at that. And funnily enough, he said, no, James, you're not crazy at all. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, that Smart is a forever car. I am never getting rid of it. And this particular one is quite a special example because it has less than 20,000 miles on the clock. He picked Squirt, and that's the car's name, up in 2021, when it had just over 18,000 miles on the clock. And the reason for the low mileage and good condition was simple. This car has spent most of its life inside a motorhome, and I think that says equally as much about the size of this car and also that motorhome. Right, coming up, my fabled 3-point turn hill start torture test. Let's see how the Smart does. And this being a city car, this kind of stuff is really quite important. The gearbox in these is a semi-automated robotized manual with 6 speeds, which is very impressive for a car this size. And actually, that's incredible. I didn't even need to do a 3-point turn there. Okay, let's talk about that, shall we? I'm not putting that on. That is how the gearbox shifts in automatic mode. Note, by the way, that automatic is an option. Not all of them had it, but none of them actually had a manual box. Instead, what you had was this semi-automated manual that you could only operate manually. Why couldn't they have just put a normal 6-speed shifter in this? I think had they done that, it would have been a lot better received. But I suppose packaging would have been somewhat difficult. Like just about every automated manual, in order to drive this smoothly, what you have to do is lift when changing gears. Now on a downshift, it will blip the throttle and it is quite a bit smoother, you don't really need to lift for that, but on the upshifts, you do. The Smart was available with a choice of different engines. You had either a petrol or a diesel. The early petrols were all 598cc, and later ones like this, 698cc. The power didn't actually change when the engine did, but I think torque did and a few other things as well. In any case, your choice was either 45 horsepower, 51, or here 61, with there also being the range-topping Brabbers having a terrifying 74 horses. The diesel, meanwhile, had to do with, are you ready for this? 41. And I don't care how little this weighs, 41 horsepower. Oh, and today I bet it's not even ULEZ compliant. These mercifully are, although, and this does make me laugh and cry, these are not exempt from the congestion charge. An Audi e-tron is, a Porsche Taycan is, a Tesla Model X is, this is not. 2.5 meters long, and it's not exempt from the congestion charge. Come! Anyway, to the matter at hand, you'll find that little 3-cylinder Mercedes engine tucked under the boot in the back, which does still have a little bit of room in it, though predictably not masses. Impressively, it opens like the tailgate on a Range Rover, so the top flips up and then the bottom comes out, and though apparently it will support the weight of a person, I'm not going to put that to the test. And I have to say that, mock it though I might, that is just one of many examples where it looks like quite a bit of effort was put into the design and manufacture of this car, because you would expect this, being a Mercedes product, to also be something of a parts bin. Yet in here, I can't really detect anything obviously Mercedes, or indeed obviously anything else. And they have really tried to make it quite as funky as they can. The exterior looks are, of course, instantly recognisable thanks to the combination of size and the shape of it. Curiously, because the car is kind of half silver and half not, on the V5, regardless of what colour the car is, it will always say silver or black. These higher level trim models, this is the Passion, which is the highest below the Brabus, has nice features like a leather steering wheel, leatherish around the gear lever here for what little good it does, and this glass roof with, wait for it, the world's silliest sun visor. I mean, do you have to like do that as you go around a bend, keep the sun in view? I don't know. It is just about large enough to kind of cover up, I guess, everything if it's here, but that's just weird. The little 2-spoke steering wheel is quite adorable. I do like that. I love the simplicity of the dash, which gives you a nice clear analog readout for your speed that goes all the way up to 85, and I think the car will more or less get there, and a very, very basic old school digital readout below, giving you your fuel, temperature, miles, and your gear mode. This is a city car, which I think did absolutely nail the brief. I recall when they were trying to promote these, one of the things they used to sell it was the fact that in a regular parking space where you'd get one car kind of long ways, you could get 3 of these sideways. The turning circle is really quite fabulous, I have to say. I'm not sure it's London taxi good, but it's not far off. Yeah, at low speeds, that oh, that's annoying. I think you do get to know it. I'm in auto mode again, but I might put it back into manual. You activate that by pressing a button on the side, and then you're in until you press the button again, which I suppose in some ways is better than some Porsches I've been in. Do you reckon I can bounce it off the limiter? I'm sure Paul won't mind. Let's slow down. Let's not be totally mechanically unsympathetic. Let's find out. It's 4,000 RPM, 5,000. No, it'll change for me. Ah, have to deduct points for that. No, I won't. Anyway, this interior, actually, cheap, awful, nasty materials aside, which I'm pretty sure we did also mock when we were kids aside, and the shapes I love and everything, it's just really, really quite cool. It's amazing. I love it, especially this sort of centre stack, let's call it here. At the top you've got a couple of pods, one of which is your rev counter, which again in a car like this you wouldn't always expect to get, but you've got. Another of which is your clock, which is kind of pointless, it didn't need to be that big. Then you've got your basic controls here, you've got your lock, hazard, rear demist, aircon button, you've got some vents, you've got your basic controls for your heater, a stereo, which is the original. Paul likes to keep things like that original, and I have to say he's a star for doing that. Below that you've then got a little, I think it's it's an oddments tray, and then below that you've got the coolest thing. You've got essentially 4 kind of mounting points, 2 which you can install various accessories, one of which being a CD holder, one of which I think is a cup holder. I love that. So simple, so elegant, so clever. It's just really, really cool. And let's talk about the drive, shall we? Okay, because I've been driving it now for a little while, and I know I haven't mentioned it. I quite like it. I do. No assistance for the steering, because it simply doesn't need it. Even when stationary, it is essentially fingertip light, because with it being rear engined and super light anyway, there's basically no weight over those also tiny 145 section wide front tyres. This does mean that ultimate grip is somewhat limited, and if you're trying to have fun, you do need to be careful, because you can tell that, yeah, already there it's trying to start to understeer. This is a car with relatively low limits. You are going to approach relatively quickly. But but it's a joy, it's a delight. The steering has a nice sort of weighting and feel to it. These seats are okay, the material's a little bit uncomfortable. I'm getting kind of warm, possibly related to the fact that with the engine being sort of, well, essentially by your bum, I mean, well, put it this way, nobody's going to freeze to death, I think, in one of these. Oh, I hope to God nobody has frozen to death in a smart car, because otherwise that's going to be really bad PR for me. Note to self, check nobody's frozen to death in a smart car before you release the edit. The brake pedal, nice, responsive, really good feel actually, better even than in many a modern day sports car. Yes, the gearbox is a letdown, the gearbox is silly, but to be honest, I think if you had a traditional lever, I mean, even this one actually keeps digging in the side of my leg. You might also have noticed that the passenger seat is actually mounted a little bit further back than that for the driver, just so your shoulders don't rub all that often. That's nice. I'm sure they stole that from the Lotus Elise. There is no escaping, though, that the ride is on the jittery side. It hasn't really calmed down at all during the time that I've driven it, and I suppose that was inevitable, given the combination of impossibly short wheelbase. The whole car is only 2.5 meters long, meaning it's only about that much longer than an Isetta bubble car. It's not particularly wide, about 1.5 meters long. They did also do a special version for the Japanese market that they narrowed ever so slightly and built with the old 600cc engine to meet the K car regulations. Let's see how good that turning cycle is, shall we? Oh, crumbs. No, it is London Taxi good. No, it really is London Taxi good. And of course, it's much smaller than a London Taxi 2. Ha! Fabulous. It did shift down gears for me as well, so it didn't stall, which is nice, and I didn't even notice it doing that. Curiously, for the second generation of these, which really is a facelift of this that had to grow to accommodate for new safety regs and the like, they moved to a 5-speed robotised manual, which is a curious choice. I'm sure it's probably in all ways that are relevant better, but it's one less, isn't it? Which in my mind makes it not as good. I'm told that 6th gear in this is actually fairly long. In auto mode, it will only engage it over 60 mile an hour, but on the motorway, it means that at 70 mile an hour, you're doing less than 3,000 RPM. So even in those circumstances, it is a genuinely economical car, meaning that the 33-litre fuel tank is actually far more adequate than you might think. I am really enjoying this car. Oh, in case you wondered, by the way, this is in the colour that, in my mind, nearly all smart cars are, and it's called Star Blue.
But, just like a Pontiac Fiero or BMW Z1, the Smart's panels are all easily removable, and the idea is that if you didn't like the colour of your car, then you could just buy a new set of panels and have it changed at the dealership. Another great idea that I'm sure absolutely nobody took advantage of. Of course, if you really wanted to stand out, then you should have bought the most bizarre of all Smarts, the Crossblade.
Yeah, little sections like that really upsets the car. Oh, and great, there's a GR Yaris behind me. Oh, excellent. I feel like I've brought a feather to a gunfight. I think I'm going to let him pass, because I don't want to be that person. There'll be an opportunity to do that in a minute. Oh, mind the wildlife. Out the way, poultry. Oh, and the jogger. Yeah, the steering doesn't exactly respond quickly to you. Like many a manual rack, it's quite slow. The car also does tip and roll and pitch and yaw and all those other things as well, quite easily and quite readily. But I am really enjoying it. In spite of my protestations, I was almost doing the speed limit back there, and I'm sure Mr. Yaris behind me is twiddling his thumbs, probably got a deck of cards out, but I'm having a great time. I'm almost disappointed, because I was really looking forward to absolutely laying into this thing, but I just quite like it. I'm really glad that Paul has brought this out today, and if you want to know a little bit more about this car, and indeed some others that he is actually doing a bit of YouTube as a hobby as well, and I'll put the link to that in the description down below for you. Alright, come on, old girl, come on, let's chase that Yaris. Power! It makes a half-decent noise, this thing, as well. You can hear it nearly all the time. Although, I did for a little bit think it had 2 exhausts. It doesn't. The chassis, though, just has a very odd look about it. I should also mention maintenance. Because these did actually eventually sell in fairly decent numbers, parts are readily available and generally speaking not that horrible to get a hold of, though servicing is something you want to pay attention to. This is looked after by a place called Smart Technics, and they're over in Birmingham way, I think, and they apparently are very, very good. If you own one of these, I'm told it's worth taking it to a specialist. So then, I'm having a good old time. Why is it that this car didn't do well? Or more accurately, why is it, James, that you've put a dirty, great big clickbait title on the video saying that these were a disaster? Well, that's because they were. You see, the Smart enterprise, in the space of, I think, about 3 or 4 years, managed to lose its parent, Mercedes-Benz, something like €4 billion. Why and how? Despite the fact this was clearly meant to be the future of transport, well, the fact is, it's a future we just weren't ready for. In the late 1990s, there wasn't a ULEZ zone. Petrol was under £1 a litre. We simply didn't care. We didn't care in enough quantity about the planet, and I have to say, it's absolutely shameful, genuinely, that today our solution to our environmental and congestion crises is the likes of the dirty, great big, massive electric SUVs that seem to have taken over. Whereas, to me, I'm with Gordon Murray on this one, and anyone who knows my channel will know that I'm not the biggest Gordon Murray fanboy, but small, economical, cheap to produce, cheap to run cars should be the future. If you don't need more than 2 seats, this really is all the car you should ever need. For 70% of people, this would happily do 70% of all your journeys, perhaps even more than that. And in that circumstance, why wouldn't you have something like this? Well, that's really, really simple. Because it's an odd duck, it's a weird looking thing. People like having far more room and space than they need, and although this actually does sit you up quite high, the modern audience likes to sit even higher, being something even bigger, because despite the fact you've got this beautiful, wonderful safety cell, people are simple. And it really is a damnation of your modern customer that actually they'd rather sit in some big, horrid, badly put together, poorly constructed piece of awful, awful rot, because it feels more substantial than this high-tech, sleekly put together, lovingly designed piece of engineering. It is a sad fact that perception and reality are two entirely separate things when it comes to the attitude of the modern day car buyer, and unfortunately perception is the one that nearly always wins out, wrong as that might be. The gearbox was certainly also, I think, an error of judgment. Though petrol-heady types eventually got to sort of half like them, just about nobody else really did. And for your average car-buying customer, well, they've either preferred a manual or a traditional auto, which in this segment is a rarity. Certainly back then, I suppose you could have had a CVT, but people really don't like those.
But ultimately, pricing and a lack of market research was surely the downfall of the Smart. The list price of a Passion for Two, like the one featured today, back in 2002 was £8,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's the equivalent of just under £14,000 now. For some context, the same money would have bought you a Nissan Micra, a variety of different Suzukis, a Rover 25, a Renault Clio, Fiat Punto, Citroën Saxo, and the list goes on. The simple fact is that the Smart car was caught between a rock and a hard place. All of those cars have 4 seats, and for anyone looking for a cheap car, they were simply more practical for the money. Even if only 1 in 100 journeys needed something bigger than a Smart, it just made sense to get that one thing that would cover every scenario. That then left you either with those who loved the concept, of whom there simply were not enough, and those who didn't need one, but had convinced themselves they were happy to spend that money on something that small, essentially as a fashion accessory. Unfortunately for Smart, being attached to Mercedes dealers almost certainly worked against them. For the customer who could afford a whole Smart car as a second or third family car or runabout, they could almost certainly afford either the larger and equally radical but slightly more expensive A2, or, more accurately, the then new Mercedes A-Class. Priced even higher, near double what a Smart was, the A-Class was still a small car to most, and definitely appealed to the well-heeled family. and being double the price of a Smart was likely trivial because it had double the seats, double the boot, and of vital importance in the school-run Grand Prix, a Mercedes badge, which back then still counted for something even if Merc were trying hard to ruin their reputation. Putting one of those essentially next door to every Smart dealership almost certainly ruined what little chance it ever had.
But the good news, it's not entirely too late, because there are still plenty of these out there, and prices start from just about £2,000. And if I were able to get my camera kit in the back of one of these, as much as I know you might think it's a silly notion for someone like myself to buy an original Smart car, I actually think this is a genuinely cool, interesting and crucially important piece of engineering that we really should have done a lot more to celebrate than we ever did. So I hope in some very small way my extraordinarily late contribution to the party can help. I'm told Smart owners are a generally cool, funky and interesting group of people, and Paul is someone who freely admits he buys cars because they're interesting, because they're unusual and because they appeal to him. He didn't buy this because of its eco-credentials or anything of the sort. He bought it because it's a well-engineered piece of machinery and a fascinating piece of motoring history. And I'm with him on that. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I really like the Smart ForTwo. 17-year-old me would be very disappointed. Suppose now I have to try a Smart RoadStr and complete the set. Anyway, a huge thank you to Paul for bringing his car out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.